Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, members of the board, Mr. Stewart Tom, building official, Fire Marshal Jeff Halpert, staff, and thank you for joining us today for Building and Fire Board of Appeals meeting. I'd like to welcome Mr. Brej Mardian first. He's a new member of the board.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. And we'd like to start by calling the roll, please.
Sure. Board Member Alexander Wu.
Here.
Board Member Brej Mardian.
Here.
Board Member John Tatulian.
Here.
Board Member Michael Chakmajian, absent. And Chairman Eric Kashishian.
Here. Thank you. Going over the agenda, I realize presentation and commendations, I don't think there is any.
If I may,
Yes.
Chairman Kashishian, just to, under presentations, just to expand a little bit upon your welcome of Mr. Mardian to the board, I would also like to extend my welcome to Mr. Mardian. He has, of course, served as a board member on various other city boards and commissions, and as a licensed architect, he is a welcome addition to the Building and Fire Board. So in advance, thank you for your service.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Thank you. Oral communication.
Today we have none.
Today we have none. Thank you. And approval of the minutes of previous meeting.
We need a
At
motion.
item 4A, we have minutes from our regularly scheduled meeting back on December 15th, 2010. It has been quite a while since we have had a meeting because this board generally serves in the capacity of an appeal board. And as the board members know, very seldomly do we have an appeal that cannot be resolved at the staff level. So this takes us back to December 15th for the minutes. A copy of the minutes was included in your packets, so you could review them. And if there are no corrections or adjustments to the minutes, it would be appropriate to have a motion for adoption of the minutes.
Okay. Can we have a motion to adopt the meetings? Entertain a motion, please.
It would have to be, yeah. I would like to make a motion to accept the minutes as presented.
Is there a second?
I was absent.
Oh.
I'm a new commissioner, so I have to abstain.
You know what? Actually, Board Member Wu is very astute there. We were hoping that Board Member Chakmajian would be here since Mr. Mardian was not on the board at the time and Mr. Wu is not present to evaluate whether or not the minutes are accurate. What we'll need to do is we will need to defer this and we will hold these minutes over until our next meeting. And hopefully we will have 3 members that are present that could comment as to the acceptability of those minutes. So thank you very much. With that, Celeste, can you make a note to carry the minutes for December 15th, 2010 over until our next meeting?
Yes.
Now, just for clarification, is it December 15, 2010 or 11?
Correct. 2010.
Oh.
We did not have any...
Has been that long.
we had no meetings last year.
Okay. Thank you. Well, we don't have any old business.
Today we have none.
Okay, great. And we move on to new business.
Thank you very much. Chairman Kashishian, members of the board, this takes us to item 6A, and this, of course, is the real purpose for which we are meeting. For the benefit of the board and our viewing public, I would like to remind everybody that this board really serves 2 very important purposes to the city. Number 1, of course, is it does serve as an appeal body. But number 2, this is the duly appointed board which we utilize for public hearings when we do have a matter that does need to be presented to the public for review and comment. The most frequent manner in which we use the board for public hearings of this matter is every 3 years when we go through the code adoption process. And in fact, we did that this past cycle when we adopted the code, which is currently being enforced. Today what we have is actually a follow-up to an action that has already been taken by our City Council. A little while ago, the City Council chose to approve ordinance number 5736, which had a small number of amendments to the state's new Green Building Standards Code. Upon adoption of those standards, it is necessary for us to take this follow-up step because a small number of those Green Building Standard amendments are related to energy. In the state of California, when an amendment to an energy standard is proposed by a jurisdiction, it is necessary for those amendments to be adopted and certified by the California Energy Commission. Prior to that, we are required to hold a public hearing to indicate what it is that we will be presenting to the public, to the California Energy Commission, and to discuss the cost effectiveness of that. What I'm going to do at this time is I will walk the board through exactly what those amendments are and what has been done to demonstrate the cost effectiveness. And then if the board sees fit, there will be 4 separate motions that need to be made and voted upon. And I will have Celeste read them individually, one at a time, into the record. Okay. And with that said, if you will turn to the second tab in your packet, you will find the staff report for this particular item. Since this is a new procedure or a new process that the City of Glendale has never had to follow before, because we have never amended an energy standard here in Glendale, I'm going to go ahead and take the time to read the staff report. It's very short, but I'm going to go ahead and read it verbatim into the record. And if there are any questions, feel free to stop me and ask. But the staff report is pretty clear, and it does speak for itself. This is the staff report dated August 15, 2012. It is for a public hearing. The purpose of that public hearing is to review. It's for the review and approval of ordinance number 5736 and associated cost energy effectiveness study. There is a recommendation. That recommendation is to find that ordinance number 5736 establishes cost-effective local energy standards that will ensure that residential and non-residential buildings in the City of Glendale will consume no more energy than permitted by Title 24, Part 6. This is actually a rather unique situation. Today, the applicant is myself. As the city's building official, I am the individual that is presenting this before the board. Ordinarily, I serve as advisory staff to this board, and the applicant is the person who might be appealing a matter. Today, I am the applicant, and my request is to conduct a public hearing for the purpose of evaluating the energy cost effectiveness of ordinance number 5736 and verifying compliance with Title 24, Part 6. There are 3 applicable codes that are related to this item. I did not include them here because you're probably fairly familiar with them. Item number 1 is the 2010 California Green Building Standards Code. As I mentioned in my introduction, this is the first time that the state of California and the City of Glendale has enforced green building standards, and the standards that we are enforcing are based on the 2010 California Green Building Standards Code. The second applicable code is the 2010 California Energy Code, and the reason for that is that some of the amended Green Building Standards Code building standards are related to energy provisions in the California Energy Code. And then third, of course, is Building and Safety Code of the City of Glendale, 2011, Volume 9. Volume 9 is where we adopted into Glendale's Building and Safety Code the Green Building Standards. Previous to the adoption of the Green Building Standards, the City of Glendale Building and Safety Code only had 8 volumes. But for the first time ever, we now have 9 volumes, and that 9th volume is the City of Glendale's amended Green Building Standards. Summary. On June 7, 2011, the Glendale City Council adopted ordinance number 5736. which established local amendments to the 2010 California Green Building Standards Code. A small number of said amendments establish energy conservation standards which are more stringent than the basic standards contained within Title 24, Part 6 of the California Code of Regulations. Prior to enforcement of local amendments which affect energy consumption, said amendments must be approved and certified by the California Energy Commission. All of the local amendments relative to energy consumption were modeled after standards contained within the optional Tier 1 provisions of the California Green Building Standards Code, with the exception of one additional standard related to radiant roof barriers. While the Tier 1 related amendments have been found to be cost-effective by numerous jurisdictions throughout the state of California, the additional amendment related to radiant roof barriers had not been analyzed in terms of specific cost-effectiveness. As a required element for consideration by the California Energy Commission, a separate cost-effectiveness analysis was required in order to justify this additional standard. In order to satisfy the cost-effectiveness criterion, an additional report was prepared by Gable Associates, LLC. A copy of such report, titled Energy Cost Effectiveness of Radiant Barrier Roofs in the Glendale Green Building Ordinance, dated May 18, 2012, is attached hereto as Exhibit B. There should be some additional tabs in your packet, and Exhibit B is that cost-effectiveness analysis from Gable and Associates. The analysis confirms that radiant roof barriers are cost-effective with a simple payback period ranging from 7 to 16 years, with an average payback within the 11 to 12-year range within Climate Zone 9. Assuming that the useful life of roof sheathing is 30 years, the analysis confirms that radiant roof barriers are indeed cost-effective and will result in simple payback of the investment during the first half of the useful life of the roof sheathing alone. Assuming the useful life of buildings within Glendale exceeds 30 years, the financial savings related to radiant roof barriers will greatly exceed the installation cost of the radiant barrier. Due to the need to secure a specific cost-effectiveness analysis related to radiant roof barriers, the City of Glendale has not been able to submit the local amendments to the California Energy Commission for approval and certification. Now that the cost-effectiveness analysis is complete, the City of Glendale will proceed forward with an application for approval with the CEC. Public review and approval by the Building and Fire Board of Appeals is necessary before said application may be submitted. And that, of course, is the purpose of today's hearing. Recommendation: it is recommended that the Building and Fire Board of Appeals conduct a public hearing in an open forum in accordance with the Brown Act. It is further recommended that the Board consider all information provided, including testimony, which may be presented during such public hearing. After the conclusion of the public hearing, if the Board finds that the local amendments relative to energy consumption are cost-effective and ensure that buildings consume no more energy than permitted by Title 24, Part 6, the building official will submit an application to the California Energy Commission to request approval and certification. And then, of course, there are exhibits. Ordinance number 5736, which was the ordinance by which the City Council adopted the amendments to the Green Building Standards Code, is Exhibit A. And then B, Energy Cost Effectiveness of Radiant Barrier Roofs in the Glendale Green Building Ordinance by Gable Associates, LLC, dated May 18, 2012, is Exhibit B. At this time, now that the staff report has been read into the record, it would be appropriate for you to open the public hearing. We can discuss the matter. I can answer any questions that you might have. And if any members of the public choose to comment or ask any questions, then would be the appropriate time. So, Mr. Chairman, at this time, it would be appropriate for you to open the public hearing.
The public hearing is open now.
Very good. With that, if it pleases the Board, what I would suggest is perhaps I can take a moment to very quickly go over ordinance number 5736, just to familiarize the board with what those few amendments were, and I'll point out which ones are energy related. I think it's kind of obvious, and which ones are not. If you have any questions, you can certainly ask those at that time, and we can take it from there.
Great, thank you.
Very good. Ordinance number 5736. A copy of that should be in your agenda. This ordinance, as I mentioned before, was adopted by the City Council on June 7th of 2011. And basically what we have is we have a small number of amendments. On page 1 of that particular ordinance, you'll find that we did add a new definition to the residential code. That definition is for low-rise residential. The reason that we had to add a definition for low-rise residential is that there are some buildings which really, while they include residential occupancies, they certainly behave more like non-residential buildings. What we're talking about are very, very tall buildings, high-rise condominium-type projects and things of that nature. What most jurisdictions in California did, including the City of Glendale, is we adopted a new definition for low-rise residential, which basically defines a building that is of residential occupancy and is 6 stories or less in height. Based on this definition, it's my understanding that the State Department of Housing and Community Development has given consideration to this, and it's likely that we're going to see this exact definition in the next iteration of the code as well. This, by the way, is consistent with the Title 24 energy standard definition. So we have this now matching the energy code to the Green Building Standards Code. If you turn to page 2 of the ordinance, you'll find the first real amendment to the Green Building Standards, and that falls under Section 301.2.3. In effect, what the City of Glendale City Council did was adopted a provision wherein single-family dwellings that are greater than 5,000 square feet in size, if they are newly constructed, those new single-family dwellings will be required to adhere to not only Cal Green but also the additional Tier 1 standards. This is consistent with what a number of jurisdictions throughout California have done. The threshold for which the Tier 1 standards would apply has varied among different jurisdictions. Some jurisdictions have actually mandated that the Tier 1 standards apply to all projects. Here in Glendale, we took a rather balanced approach, and we determined that very, very large buildings do consume more energy than smaller buildings and should be held to a slightly higher standard. And the trigger that was decided upon by the City Council was 5,000 square feet. We also had some study groups that convened to help us arrive at this threshold, and the general consensus among the study groups as well was 5,000 square feet. If my memory serves me correctly, I believe that Board Member Wu was a member of some of those early study groups. It was a little while ago. Yeah.
Is that a year or so ago, a year and a half?
Oh, it was more than that. It was
There was a
few years
green
ago.
task force before.
Did you serve in that as well? So we may have had 2 board members on that. But that's where some of this discussion came up, whether or not to have Tier 1 apply to all the projects or just to the very, very large projects. We don't have too many new custom homes that exceed 5,000 square feet, but we do have a few every now and then, and those projects would need to comply with Tier 1 as well. Also on page 2, Section 4.106.4, we have a modified standard which deals with water permeable surfaces. For residential development only, 20% of residential uncovered parking, walking, or patio surfaces will now be required to be water permeable. That can be anything from individual paving stones to some other type of hard surface that will allow some of the storm water to percolate into the ground, thereby helping to recharge the groundwater rather than running directly off into the storm drain system and running down the curbs and gutters.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Stewart,
Yes.
Question I have, does this apply when you're only doing 5,000? Where does this apply to water permanently serve it?
It would apply to all new construction.
All new construction?
Yes, and actually, Chairman Kashishian, Board Member Mardian reminds me, I should take the time to point out that here in the city of Glendale, the green building standards apply only to new construction. Some jurisdictions have gone a little bit further to apply triggers, which will require that the green building standards apply to additions and alterations as well. Here in the city of Glendale, we gave quite a bit of consideration to that, and at this time, the city of Glendale has determined that it did not want to extend these standards further than the rest of the state of California, and since the model California Green Building Standards Code applies only to new construction, that is the same here. So therefore, whereas the first amendment that I referred to talks about new single-family dwellings greater than 5,000 square feet, from this point forward, all of the provisions that I'm referring to are not limited to single-family dwellings 5,000 square feet. They would apply to any other provision as well, provided it's new construction, okay, from the ground up. Thank you. Moving on to page 3, we get to the next item, and that is section 4.203.1. You'll find that about the middle of the page on page 3. This is clearly an energy-related item, and under performance approach, what this new amended standard does is it requires that new residential buildings, if they are designed utilizing a energy performance approach, sometimes referred to as a calculation or a points method, that those new buildings be designed to be at least 15% more effective than the minimum energy standards contained within Title 24. So in effect, what this would require is that when a new residential building is constructed, everything from the insulation to the type of air conditioning and heating system to their water heaters to other features like that be selected strategically so that when their energy calculations are performed, they are able to demonstrate that that building not only meets the Title 24 energy standard, but it exceeds those minimum standards by at least 15%. So this, being directly related to energy, is certainly one in which we want to demonstrate that it is as good or better than Title 24, which, of course, since it exceeds it by 15%, is definitely better than Title 24. And this would be one of the items that we will be asking the Energy Commission to certify for us. If you turn the page to page 4, we get to section 4.205.1. This is the one rather unique provision that I had referred to earlier that Glendale has adopted that involves radiant roof barriers. Here what we are requiring is that new residential buildings utilize a radiant roof barrier. For those that are not familiar with what a radiant roof barrier is, it's a reflective material. It can be either applied individually in between the actual roof rafter bays, or it can be integrated with the typical plywood roof sheathing. The plywood substrate that's used for roof sheathing comes in two different flavors. One is a normal type of sheathing. The other actually has a rather silver reflective finish already applied to it. Either one is acceptable and satisfies this requirement, and what it does is it ensures that we don't have too much heat loss, primarily during the colder winter months, that it reflects some of that heat back into the house.
So you mean a roll staple to the underneath of the sheeting is acceptable?
Absolutely, yes.
Doesn't have to be laminated, I mean, to the actual plywood?
That's a very good question. What Mr. Mardian is referring to is, in addition to the reflective surface that's already integral to the plywood, an individual can purchase radiant barrier roll material, which can just be folded in between the actual roof rafter bays and just stapled to the rafter bays with the reflective side down, and it serves the exact same purpose. Some people prefer the roll application. Some people prefer to use the radiant barrier that's just integrated with the plywood. They're both effective.
Much cleaner.
Also on page 4, at the very bottom, under section 4.207.1, we have a requirement here in Glendale that heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, if a gas-fired heating equipment is installed, that it have an annual fuel utilization efficiency ratio of 0.90 or higher. Basically, what this means is that when a natural gas furnace is installed in a new residential building, that the unit should specifically be looked at to make sure that the AFUE is 0.90 or higher. Virtually any piece of heating equipment that's rated as Energy Star or better is going to meet that standard, and what it will do is it loses less heat up the exhaust stack and is more efficient, so it takes less gas to heat your home. On the facing page, on page 5, we get to section 4.207.2, and that's the corollary to that. On the cooling equipment side, if air conditioning is installed for a new residential building, what we are looking for here in Glendale is that the air conditioning system have a seasonal energy efficiency rating, or SEER as we call it, higher than 13.0, and it have an energy efficiency ratio, or EER, of 11.5 or greater. Once again, if the air conditioning equipment that is selected for a new residential building is chosen as being Energy Star rated or better, those will certainly meet these standards. If somebody is going to purchase a rather low-end piece of equipment, they better look at these numbers if it's for new construction, because some of that really low-end equipment is not very efficient and it might not meet these standards. Of course, the reason for this is if it takes less electricity to have the same degree of cooling for a building, not only does it save the property owner money over the long run to keep their home air conditioned in the winter, but it will utilize less electrical energy and help to avoid rolling brownouts, blackouts, and so forth. About the middle of page 5, we get to water heating efficiency, which is also another one of the energy-related amendments. At section 4.208.1, we have a standard for tank-type water heaters. So your typical storage water heater that is the most common, what we're looking for there is a storage tank water heater having an energy factor higher than 0.60. And at section 4.208.2, if a builder is choosing to go with a tankless water heater, what we're looking for is an energy factor of at least 0.80. So that 0.80 is certainly more efficient than the 0.60 that would be acceptable for a storage tank water heater. I do want to point out that that number of 0.80 is very important, because some people are under the impression that all tankless water heaters are just very efficient. Tankless water heaters do tend to be more efficient than storage tank water heaters, because you don't have a large volume of hot water just losing heat through the wall of the heater all day long when that hot water is not in use. But that does not necessarily mean that a tankless water heater is highly efficient. If the heat exchange is not designed properly, a lot of that heat still goes up the exhaust stack. So therefore, section 4.208.2 is intended to make sure that if an individual chooses to install a tankless water heater, they should read those specifications very closely to make sure that for a new building, they choose a unit that has an energy factor of 0.80 or better.
Excuse me if I may interrupt.
Yes.
But the new building will require Title 24, and if we're using these numbers, they have to use this efficiency to make it work.
Actually, that's a very, very good point. Title 24, these amendments are in here to cover all scenarios. As board member Mardian just pointed out, if they choose to use the performance or calculation method, the only way that they can do that is to use a rather high efficiency unit, which would guarantee 0.80 or better. But keep in mind, not everybody is required to use the performance approach. You can still use the prescriptive method in which you choose a package which prescriptively defines what your maximum fenestration size is, what your roof and wall insulation is, and so forth, at which point you would not be bound to these standards. So this is a second method to make sure that you use a high-efficiency unit. But very good point. If you flip the page, only a couple more pages here. On page 6, at section 4.211.1, we have a standard which technically is related to energy, although it doesn't really cost anything, and that is space for future solar installation. What we are requiring now for new construction is we would certainly like developers to put solar PV panels on their roof, but that may not be a good choice for everybody. For those individuals that are building new residential structures and they are choosing not to put solar PV on the roof, what this requirement would do is make sure that the building is what we call solar ready. And in order to be solar ready, what they would need to do is just plan their building properly so that they don't indiscriminately put things on their roof like roof vents and other features that might be future hindrances or obstacles to placing solar PV on their roof. If they plan it properly and locate penetrations in their roof in appropriate locations to reserve a sufficiently large clear area so that in the future, if either they or a future building owner chooses to put solar panels on their roof, there's a nice convenient area. It will make it easier for them, and that actually doesn't cost anything. That's just planning ahead where to put your vents. The only area here which would cost something, which is really insignificant, is that in addition to reserving a space on the roof, we are requiring that they run a 1-inch empty piece of electrical conduit from the service panel to a location reasonably close to the roof. It will usually terminate at a pull box or something like that underneath the eaves or even in an attic. And the reason for that, of course, is that if a space is reserved so that in the future somebody can put solar PV on their roof, we don't want them to be discouraged from putting solar PV because all of a sudden it's going to be difficult for them to pull the wires. If they have an empty electrical conduit with just a string in there, then sometime in the future if somebody chooses to put solar PV, the conduit's already in place, they can then pull the wire at this point.
Can I ask a question, Mr. Stewart?
Yes.
What happens when we have a slope roof? Are you telling the new building designers to design an area? I mean, we have roof tiles and so forth in some of these cases. I mean, are we designating a flat area or because you're going to cover the roof tile one way or another?
Understand. Chairman Kashishian, Board Member Mardian, this requirement would apply regardless of the type of roof finish, whether it's tile, composition, or flat, whether it's sloped or not. They would still need to reserve that particular area. It's not a lot of area that we're asking that they reserve, and these days solar PV panels can be installed very, very safely and effectively regardless of the type of material, even on lightweight concrete tile or clay tile or composition type materials. It's possible to do that.
Well, I've seen them. It's just, you have to really consider that during design of
Sure.
the building. You can't just come back and think of it later. Okay.
Moving on, item number 7, I'm sorry, on page number 7 at section 4.509.1 and also 4.509.2, natural light and natural ventilation. The Green Building Code covers a lot of building design standards that are not necessarily reserved to energy efficiency or water efficiency or material efficiency, such as utilizing recycled materials. Some of the Green Building Code is intended to provide for healthier environments. That's part of the green movement. And in sections 4.509.1, what we are looking for is that the minimum net glazed area of habitable rooms be at least 10% of the floor area, and for natural ventilation, that the openable area of those windows or doors be at least 5% of the floor area. What's interesting is those numbers were chosen because they actually match what the Uniform Building Code had for years and years and years. In fact, most designers here on the western third of the United States are already accustomed to 10% light and 5% ventilation. So this really has no impact on them at all. We're just accustomed to having windows and doors of that size. We put that in here in Glendale because we did feel that it does make for a brighter, more healthful interior residential environment, and mainly because the California Residential Code that was adopted, which is based on the IRC, the International Residential Code, reduced those areas very slightly. Under the base California Residential Code, the minimum area for natural light is 8% instead of 10%, and the natural ventilation is 4% instead of 5%. So basically what we've done is we've amended our green building standards to match what we used to have under the Uniform Building Code, and the designers have not had any problems with that because we're already accustomed to it on the West Coast.
Mr. Tom,
Yes.
a quick comment on that. I believe the current code, even though it requires the natural light and ventilation, but I think there are certain exceptions that they do allow even habitable rooms be without natural light and ventilation and just have artificial lighting. Now, is this going to basically supersede that requirement? Basically, every habitable room in Glendale requires to have minimum 10%.
Yes, actually this would, and that is the intent here under the Green Building Code, because we do believe that natural light, natural ventilation does make for a more healthful environment. Keep in mind that natural light, natural ventilation can come in a number of different forms. It can come from a skylight.
Correct.
In fact, an openable skylight can provide both the natural light and ventilation as well. And then also, the definitions for natural light and ventilation would follow the same provisions within the residential code, which allow for what we call derived light. When you have one room which may not be adjacent to an exterior wall of the building, if you are on a lower floor in a multi-story house and you can't get a skylight, you can still derive light from an adjoining room, provided your walls are sufficiently open. This is very, very manageable. And like I said, it's exactly the same standard that existed under the UBC for decades.
Years ago, that's right.
Years ago.
So I suppose then this section will not let you have a basement basically for habitable purposes unless it has some kind of a light well for natural light and ventilation.
Exactly.
Okay.
Which is exactly how they were designed before under the UBC. A basement that is completely underground and dark can still be constructed for storage and other purposes, but it's not really supposed to be used for habitable purposes. You should still have a light well or something of that nature to have some natural light and ventilation.
How does the City of Glendale look at gyms, exercise rooms, or movie theaters, stuff like that in the basement? Are those habitable areas?
Considered a habitable
They're all
space?
habitable.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, in the same token, Mr. Chair, the minimum openable area, I mean, you have to have for, especially in a window, you have to have, I think it's 5.7 on the second story
Oh,
to have an open area to exit. So-
emergency egress.
Emergency
Right.
egress.
There are so many reasons why for habitable rooms you're going to have windows. As Board Member Martin just pointed out, 5.7 square feet. Exactly the right number. That is the minimum net size for emergency egress. Of course, that would only be required for a sleeping room.
Correct.
But yes, in most cases, most designers don't like to design rooms with no doors or windows. They're just not desirable. And so we just generally don't see that here in Glendale. Just to close this out, we now move to Section 5 of the Green Building Code, which are similar, but it's for non-residential. This is for commercial. And if you'd like, I can go through that, but I will tell you they're essentially the same as what we went through. For example, if you take a look at Section 5.203, this is energy performance. And once again, we're just looking at the same 15% above Title 24. So in the interest of time, unless there are any questions, there's nothing additional in the non-residential that I have not gone over. And with that, if there are any questions, I would be very happy to address them. As you can see, here in Glendale, we actually did not amend very many standards. Those that we did amend are actually, for the most part, consistent with Tier 1 standards. We just selectively chose those which we thought were very manageable and cost-effective, or would inherently add some savings to the building, such as the higher efficiency water heaters, higher efficiency air conditioners and heaters. They all have a very, very quick payback time. The only one that was rather unique to Glendale, and actually some other jurisdictions, after hearing that we have integrated it, are starting to look into it as well, is the radiant roof barrier, because the radiant roof barrier is so easy to install, and it's what we consider to be a passive device. Unlike some of the others that have savings because actively, as they are burning fuel or heating water, they are just more efficient. A radiant roof barrier is a passive device that once it's built into the building, it doesn't have to do anything. It just saves energy by virtue of its being there. And so with that, that concludes my presentation of the actual ordinance. If there are any questions about the ordinance, I would be happy to entertain them now. Or if there are not, I would suggest that you allow me to move on to the cost effectiveness analysis.
Are there any questions from the board members?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know if it's too early to ask this question. This evaluation or this test that has been conducted, does it take in consideration whether it's OSB or regular plywood?
No, it does not. They, for those that are unfamiliar, OSB stands for oriented strand board, and unlike plywood, which is comprised of individual laminations of wood, oriented strand board is made of glued compressed wafers, but it's still an engineered sheet product. OSB does come in a radiant barrier form, which has the reflective surface already integrated. Both OSB and plywood, with the reflective surface already integrated on it, does count as a radiant barrier, and both would be accepted.
In the past, OSB hasn't been, because that's flooded the market with OSB, with the foil, because it's the cheapest product out there. Regular plywood sheeting is a few dollars even more on the per sheet. The reason I'm, because there, in the past there was discussions and issues where you use OSB on the roof, especially you're susceptible to more, leakage or warpage of the plywood.
Let me address that.
I don't know if it's related to this subject, but I wanted to bring that up.
It's an unrelated subject. I will comment on it very briefly because I am familiar with what you're referring to. So since you brought the subject up, I will comment on it. But let me basically assure the board members and the viewing public that if it is a recognized radiant barrier product, it would be accepted. Now, from a structural standpoint, structural grade OSB does have recognized structural values under the code, and it can be used as a lateral roof diaphragm or floor diaphragm element. There is a tendency by some builders who tend to build slightly better quality or higher end construction to shy away from OSB, not necessarily because it is not effective as a radiant barrier or because it is not effective from a structural standpoint, because as I just mentioned, structural grade OSB does have recognized tabular values. It's because OSB has been found by some organizations, by many individuals, to be more susceptible to moisture damage. If moisture is in constant contact with that oriented strand board, either due to condensation or due to some exposure to wicking, the OSB has been found to deteriorate at an accelerated rate. And if that's what you're referring to, it is something of a known or recognized issue, and that's something that every builder needs to individually consider when they choose a material. It's no different than any other material choice. If used properly and if maintained properly, it can be a very good product. However, if the periodic or annual cost of seeing to it that the weather-resistive membrane, in other words, your roofing felt and other things, are in much better shape to prevent moisture or condensation from getting in there, will exceed the savings that you would otherwise see by going with the less expensive product, because OSB is indeed less expensive than plywood. Make no mistake, it is cheaper. But if the maintenance costs exceed that, that's a decision that the builder needs to make. But both are still recognized in the state of California as acceptable building materials.
Mr. Tom, I have one other I'm sorry. Go ahead, question? Go ahead.
Yeah, one question, Mr. Tom. Did Glendale Fire have an opportunity to provide comments for the ordinance?
Glendale Fire did have an opportunity to look at it. I don't know that Glendale Fire, Fire Marshal Halpert is here. I don't know if they really had any concerns beyond buildings regarding the green aspects of it. We didn't make any changes that would affect fire safety or life safety or anything of that nature. These are all intended just to make buildings greener. But if Fire Marshal Halpert has any comments, he's here right now.
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer your question. We did review it in concert with Building and Safety, and we didn't have any concerns. We addressed some energy-related issues in our last code adoption when we had adopted some measures that were related to PV systems for photovoltaic systems. We followed some state fire marshal guidelines on those and incorporated them into the code. And but we didn't have any concerns on this ordinance.
Are there any benefits, aside from meeting the code, but any benefits that fire sees in this ordinance? Positive benefits by having the
radiant barrier?
by having the radiant barrier in terms of fire safety or any other benefit?
I'm not aware of any fire safety related ancillary benefit to the radiant barrier other than the energy itself. Are you aware of anything?
Well, since it's a reflective surface, I guess that's what you're referring to. Well, it obviously keeps the building cooler than it would. Does that contribute to less fire hazard or something, perhaps?
I don't know that these really have such a physical effect of the building that it would really affect the building from a fire safety standpoint one way or the other. Since you brought up the issue of radiant barriers and whether or not the building is cooler, keep in mind there are two different things that generally work hand in hand. Keeping a building cooler in the summer is generally achieved by what's referred to as a cool roof, and on the exterior of the building, some roofing materials which tend to have a finish that reflects certain frequencies of light will reflect that before it gets into the building. The radiant barrier, most people don't even know it's there because it's on the underside of the sheathing or concealed in your attic where you never see it. That really reflects more of the infrared type heat in the winter, so you don't have that loss through your attic. But I don't think either of those types of materials would really have a measurable effect on fire safety one way or the other.
Basically, I have a question which really has to do with clarification of the new residential buildings. I want to know how City of Glendale looks at new residential buildings. Are we looking at buildings that are completely new, or if an existing building is gutted all the way down to foundation and rebuilt is considered new? How would this ordinance apply to those kind of buildings, if it is applicable?
First off, we generally don't see projects here in Glendale that are taken all the way down to the foundation. The main reason being that under our current code, seismic and lateral design standards are so much more stringent in California due to our seismicity than they were years and years ago, that a typical foundation and its bolting pattern and lack of hold downs really wouldn't lend itself to constructing a new building today, because we would require that the superstructure be designed to meet today's earthquake seismic standards, and so it just wouldn't make any sense. What we do see a lot of in Glendale is stripping a building down to its skeleton, so to speak, down to its studs, its roof rafters and so forth, maybe leaving a few walls up. This issue has been brought up statewide to determine whether or not that is considered an alteration or a new building. And in California, for building code and fire code applications, that is considered an existing building. So if somebody were to strip a building down, keep walls, roofs, roof rafters, floor joists, and so forth there, and add onto it or otherwise significantly alter it, in terms of application of these standards, they wouldn't be applicable because that would be an existing building. But the first example that you gave, stripping it all the way down, just removing everything down to the foundation, but then rebuilding up. If it were possible structurally to do that, we would consider that a new building, and they would have to comply with all these standards. But as I mentioned, it's not really practical to do that.
But I want to follow up on that. It's a very good question because I've run into it several times. When do you consider a new building? When you alter more than 50% on a single family, it's considered a new building.
It's a different standard. That's for the zoning code.
So building code, but I thought if you exceeded 50% of the evaluation,
No, that is not true. Under our zoning standards, anytime 50% or more of a building is replaced, you would lose all of your non-conforming zoning entitlements and have to comply with today's standards. But as far as building and fire standards are concerned, all construction that is built today, whether or not it's an entire building or it's only 10% of a building, the new construction must always comply with today's standards.
because I've gotten into it a few times, different cities where you add, let's say, more than 50% of your house to the house or square footage-wise, you have to pretty much comply with new regulations, sprinkler it, and
That's a different issue. That's a trigger point. And a trigger point may apply regardless of whether or not a building is considered to be new or existing. And here in Glendale, we also have trigger points. And if a building is modified to certain extents, either certain floor areas are added, certain valuations are exceeded, occupancy groups are changed to more hazardous occupancies, if the building is not sprinklered, it might trigger a need to retrofit an entire building with fire sprinklers as well. And we do have those standards here, but that's what's called a trigger point.
okay.
But as far as green building is concerned, green building standards, then you will look at the brand-new buildings as if they're completely brand-new.
Completely new, correct.
Okay, thank you.
And with that, if there are no other questions, I'll quickly go over the cost effectiveness.
I'm sorry, Mr.
Yes,
Chairman.
please.
Oh, certainly.
I thought of something after you said about anything fire.
Of course.
What happens, in a fire zone, you have a 5,000 square feet home, you have exposed rafters, and you have to use TNG at the eaves, and the eaves, the TNG has to go back in a little bit, because here, I'm thinking a little bit differently. We're creating an envelope with this radiant barrier, and it's supposed to go all underneath and be concealed. What happens at the eaves? Sorry. Forgive me.
Fair question. And actually, I'm impressed. You're demonstrating some of your knowledge of the code. For those that are unaware, in certain areas of the city, in particular our very high fire hazard severity zones, we do have standards under Chapter 7A, our wildland urban interface provisions, which do limit the types of materials that you can use in certain areas. In some instances, it is necessary to use solid nominal thickness sheathing, and you can't use a thinner material because it is the thinner material is more prone to ignition.
Right.
And if a thicker nominal TNG material is used, in order for there to be some continuity, it's often required to extend it at least a couple courses beyond the freeze blocking at the exterior wall. Our intent here is to see to it that there be a radiant barrier. Whether or not that radiant barrier extends all the way down to the actual edge of the plate line is really irrelevant at that point. So if it transitions over to plywood or OSB beyond those few courses of tongue and groove solid roof sheathing, and they choose to use the integral radiant barrier with the OSB or the plywood, that would be acceptable to us. We're not going to require that for the last couple of inches that they purchase rolled material.
It's going to be very hard to squeeze it in. I mean,
Well, not only that, it probably would have an insignificant effect on the
effect.
overall effectiveness of
because
the radiant
I've
barrier.
run into it, well, not necessarily run into it, but I can tell you some plant checkers will get nitty-gritty on that one, get very meticulous. I'm serious.
They might. Okay, and with that, before we move on to the cost effectiveness analysis, I think now might be a good opportunity. If there are any other questions that might be of interest or need fire expertise. I believe our fire marshal is pre-committed to another appointment and may need to leave. So if there are any questions of Fire Marshal Halpert, now might be a good time. If not, I'll move on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining. Thank you. And with that, I believe it's the second to the last tab. Yes, it's tab Exhibit B. This is the Energy Cost Effectiveness Report that I referred to. It is titled Energy Cost Effectiveness of Radiant Barrier Roofs in the Glendale Green Building Ordinance. This report is dated May 18, 2012. You will see that this report was specifically prepared for us here at the City of Glendale. The cover sheet indicates that the report was prepared for Stuart Tom, PE, CBO, building official, City of Glendale, and the report was prepared by Michael Gable of Gable Associates, LLC, up in Berkeley, California. Mr. Gable and I had discussed this before he prepared the report, and I was very, very pleased when I received this report from him. It's extremely thorough. There is an executive summary on page 1, and I will go ahead and read the executive summary. It's only a paragraph into the record so that the record does have it. This exhibit will also, a hard copy will be entered into the record. And then I'll briefly go over the methodology by which Gable Associates did find this to be cost effective. On page 1.0, executive summary. Gable Associates has researched and reviewed the energy cost effectiveness of the roof radiant barrier requirement within the City of Glendale Ordinance Number 5736, Section 4.205.1. This study considers the cost effectiveness of a radiant barrier above an attic space in 3 prototypical single-family homes. An analysis using state-approved compliant software, MicroPass version 8.1, has been conducted to evaluate annual site energy savings, site energy cost savings, and cost effectiveness of a radiant barrier. The conservative assumption made is that the radiant barrier has not already been specified in the base case design to meet the overall energy performance requirement of 50% better than state code. Omitted from the study are any external costs of climate change, either mitigation or adaptation, associated with increase in CO2 emissions or widely predicted increases in summer temperatures in California, which would tend to further increase cost effectiveness of cooling reduction measures. So what does this mean? What this means is that Gable Associates took 3 prototype projects and took a look at how effective a radiant roof barrier would be with, how effective that building would be with and without the radiant barrier, so it could find out how much energy savings would be realized, and then recognizing average costs of natural gas, electricity, and so forth, they could quantify the value of that energy savings. As indicated from the very last sentence of this analysis is actually very, very conservative because it doesn't even consider other factors that could influence climate change. And if the climate became harsher or more severe, the energy savings would be even greater, and the cost doesn't go up. So, therefore, the findings by Gable Associates are literally a worst-case scenario for Climate Zone 9. By the way, all of Glendale does fall within Climate Zone 9, so this report covers the entire city of Glendale. If you turn the page 2, what we find is the 3 prototype structures. What Gable Associates did was they took a look at the method by which most construction is done these days and typical sizes. The first case was a model 1,850 square foot 2-story building with a slab on grade. Second was medium-sized home, 2,450 square feet, 2-story slab on grade. And then 3 starts to get a little bit larger, just slightly under the 3,000 square foot range at 2,850 square feet, once again 2-story slab on grade. Fairly typical of what we see here throughout the city of Glendale. What you will find if you go down the page to the bottom of page 2 is the base case for an 1,850 square foot home, the base case having no radiant barrier, and then it follows up with the radiant barrier. not to bore you with all the details, if you turn ahead to the very last page, what you will find is a table with some energy savings and then the conclusion. And you will see that for each of the different types of projects, they actually calculate to the dollar how much a radiant roof barrier will save. Actually, if you turn back one page to page 5, it's the results, and this would be of the smaller home. For 1,850 square feet, it will show you what the incremental and total energy savings would be and what the simple payback would be in terms of how many years it will take based on what it found to be the prevailing installed cost of those radiant barriers. For the first case, anywhere from 7.3 to 10.9 years. If you flip the page to page 6, you will see once again the energy savings ranging anywhere from $47 per year to $36 per year, and the simple payback for the medium-sized prototype structure of 2,450 square feet, the simple payback range from 8.2 years to 15.6 years. And then on our large case, the 2,850 square foot home, the energy savings, which ranged from a low of $28 per year to a high of $52 per year of savings. The simple payback ranged from 8.6 to 15.7. You'll see that in Gable Associates' conclusions, he indicates that simple payback for radiant barrier in the 3 prototype single-family homes ranged from 7 to 16 years. And that's how I came up with my conclusion that the payoff, simple payoff, is about half the useful lifespan. In fact, Gable Associates used the same assumption. If you take a look at the middle of the first paragraph, assuming that the useful life of roof sheathing is 30 years, and based on this analysis, radiant barriers are cost-effective as a mandatory requirement for roofing above attic spaces in Climate Zone 9. So there wasn't a single case in which it did not pay itself off. In every single case, the radiant roof barrier paid itself off. In fact, what we found was that when you take a look at the cost-effectiveness analyses that other jurisdictions have used for the Tier 1 type standards, the radiant roof barrier actually paid itself off faster than most of the other standards that other communities have implemented. And so with that, we're actually quite happy that the radiant roof barrier was integrated into our standards. And as I mentioned before, some other cities heard that we were doing it, and they're looking into it as well because the labor is the same, the material cost is nominal, and the savings will be there. It's, as I referred to it before, it's a passive feature. It will save energy as long as it's there. And with that, that concludes my presentation. You will see exactly what our standards are, that they all ensure that buildings will use no more energy than is allowed under Title 24, Part 6, and that they are cost-effective. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any final questions. And if not, I'll walk you through the motions that we have.
I have a question, Mr. Chair. And these studies where you have the charts, and some of them have pipe insulation, some of them the pipe insulation is omitted. Then it appears on the cost table. Pipe insulation.
Pipe insulation really has no effect on the radiant barriers. I think that what Gable Associates was doing is they were trying to utilize the full range, full gamut of situations to be realistic. They didn't want to assume one way of building a structure because people build things in different manners. And so for features that were not related directly to the radiant roof barrier, I think they just mixed things up to be realistic. Are there any other questions?
Yes, Mr. Tom. Since these standards, as you mentioned, are above and beyond what the state requirements are, so-called being 50% more efficient than the Cal Green requirements, do you think or do you believe that there would be, for the homeowners, I would say, or designers or architects, engineers, contractors, would there be any federal, state, or county-wide incentives for people to upgrade their buildings to comply with these standards?
Chairman Kashish, members of the board, I really would hesitate to comment on whether or not there are any state or other financial incentives on this, because those sorts of things are constantly changing. At any given time, there might, whether they be state incentives or even local incentives to have more efficient type features within the building, there might be incentives at any given time. It was not our intent to consider that. The mere fact that they are proven to be cost effective and they pay themselves off so soon, and then after that, all the savings is just gravy on top of that. That was really the state intent in terms of the cost effectiveness analysis. Clearly, some of the things that we have here in Glendale, such as the higher efficiency air conditioning systems and so forth, if in addition to paying themselves off just during the normal useful lifetime of that equipment, if it turns out that a builder is able to get an incentive for installing something like that, that's even a greater incentive. But no, we did not consider that.
Okay, thank you.
With that, I see no other questions. And since we have no members of the public that have requested to comment, I would suggest that at this point, you close the public hearing.
Okay, so public hearing is so closed.
Very good.
Thank you.
With that, you are free to discuss and deliberate this further amongst yourselves if you would like. When you see fit, if you believe that these standards do meet the criteria that I have described, to make it simple for you, there are 4 motions that need to be made and individually voted upon. And when you're ready, Chairman Kashishian, you would need to entertain a motion for each one individually, and I would have Celeste read them into the record. So with that, I'm certainly willing to answer any final questions you might have, and if you would like to discuss it amongst yourselves, now would be appropriate.
Any questions from board members? Okay, Mr. Tom, I guess we are ready. So I would like to entertain a motion for item 4A1.
6A1.
6A1, I'm sorry, 6A1. Is there a motion to,
I'll make a motion of the approval of the energy cost effectiveness study in ordinance number 5736 as they relate to the local amendment to the 2010 California Green Building Code.
That was actually beautiful.
thank you.
Since you made the motion and read it in, Celeste doesn't have to repeat that.
Oh, I thought you
Is there
had
a
to do
second?
Second.
Thank you.
Celeste, may we have a roll call on item 6A1?
Board Member Alexander Wu,
Yes.
Board Member Michael Chokmajian, Board Member John Tatulian,
Yes.
Board Member Raj Mardian,
that. Yes.
Chairman Eric Kashishian.
Yes. So may I have a similar motion for item 6A2?
I would like to make a motion to accept item 2.
Is there a second?
Should I read it or should
Why don't you
Celeste-
go ahead and read it in?
Yes, please.
6A2 reads, confirm cost effectiveness of the local amendments contained within ordinance number 5736.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Roll call, please.
Board Member Alexander Wu,
Yes.
Board Member Michael Chokmajian, Board Member John Tatulian,
Yes.
Board Member Raj Mardian,
Yes.
Chairman Eric Kashishian.
Yes. Well, we'll move on to item 6A3. May I have a motion for that item, please?
I'll make a motion to approve and find the adoption of the local amendments to 2010 California Green Building Code is a categorically exempt from environmental review under the California Environmental Quality Act pursuant to Section 15308 of the CEQA guidelines, action by regulatory agencies for protection of the environment.
May I have a second?
I second the motion.
Thank you. And roll call, please.
Sure. Alexander Wu, Board Member Alexander Wu, Board Member Michael Chokmajian, Board Member John Tatulian,
Yes.
Board Member Raj Mardian,
Yes.
Chairman Eric
Yes.
Kashishian.
And lastly, the last item, item number 6A4. May I have a motion?
I'll make a motion to adopt, is that correct?
Yes.
Adopt 6A-4. Find that local amendments contained within ordinance number 5736 will ensure that the residential and non-residential buildings in the city of Glendale will consume no more energy than permitted by Title 24, Part 6.
Second the motion.
Thank you. Roll call, please.
Yes. Board Member Alexander Wu,
Yes.
Board Member Michael Chokmajian, Board Member John Tatulian,
Yes.
Board Member Raj Mardian,
Yes.
Chairman Eric Kishishian.
Yes.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the City of Glendale, I want to thank this board. It has basically taken the final step necessary for this item to be submitted to the California Energy Commission for their certification. And once that is done, we will be able to legally enforce these standards. And with that, the City of Glendale is on its way to a greener future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next item on the agenda.
At item 7A, we have monthly building and safety report. This is actually the last agendized item, and I can walk you through this very quickly. The very last tab of your packet has what looks like a very familiar report, and on one page is our monthly income summary, and on the reverse side is our building activity report. I would like to point out something of interest to you. You'll notice in the upper right-hand corner, this is the report which closes out June of 2012. Of course, we do work on a fiscal year that does conclude in June, and the next fiscal year starts July 1st. So therefore, this report actually represents the actual conclusion of our 2011-2012 fiscal year. So it's very revealing in terms of how much activity there was. In terms of the monthly income summary, you'll notice that, about 1/4 of the way down, there is a row called subtotal column A. And you'll notice that in the second to the right column, the total year-to-date income for building and safety, which was comprised of all the fees collected for building permits, combination permits, plan checks, plumbing, electrical, and mechanical permits, MEP, which are the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing plan checks, and then various miscellaneous fees that we collect, came out to $5,352,600. Compared to the same total income for the previous year-to-date, which closed out the previous fiscal year, which is reflected in the far right column of that same row, of $4,348,827, you'll see that this is a 23% increase. Considering the fact that the economy is less than stellar, it certainly indicates that here in Glendale, things have been rather healthy. And I'll be pointing out some of the areas in which we did have quite a bit of activity and income. Moving forward, I would like to point out a few other things of interest on the same page before I change to the second page of this report, and that is about, maybe 3/4 of the way down on this same first page, monthly income summary. There are 3 rows that follow each other. In the far left-hand column, there is an item called library mitigation fee, followed by parks mitigation fee, followed by parks Quimby fees. I'd like to bring these to your attention because some time ago the City of Glendale implemented some impact fees so that development here would start to carry their own share of paying the impacts of their development to ensure that park services and library services were funded appropriately. What is interesting is the increase in revenue during this past fiscal year that we just closed out compared to our previous fiscal year, because the previous fiscal year only had partial contributions because these were relatively new fees. In fact, for the first such item, library mitigation fee, for this past fiscal year, we brought in almost $250,000, which will go to the libraries. and that total was $240,810. Since that fee had just been enacted and we had not collected it for the full previous fiscal year, we closed out that previous fiscal year with only $41,082. So almost $200,000 more for the libraries this past fiscal year. If you go down to the next row, Parks Mitigation Fee, you'll see something similar there as well. This past fiscal year, the Parks Impact Fee generated $1,896,396 for the parks, compared to $1,083,088 the previous fiscal year. So about $800,000 more. So slightly more than $750,000 extra towards parks. And then likewise, there was an increase to the Parks Quimby fee, $547,081 compared to $364,000. If you add up the fees for those three categories, just for library, parks, and Parks Quimby, this past fiscal year, through the Permit Services Center, we collected $2.68 million compared to $1.49 million the previous fiscal year. This represents an 80% increase in what we had collected, which certainly has development paying its share of parks and library services so that those fees don't have to come from the general fund. One other thing that is very significant that I would like to point out is actually the very last row in this particular section, which is titled Urban Art Program. You'll notice that urban art, which is public art in the downtown area, this past fiscal year brought in almost $1 million, $957,085. This was also a relatively new fee. The previous fiscal year, we had barely brought in $12,000. So almost $1 million. What does all of this mean? If you take a look at the lower portion of this first page, there's a row that is titled Total, column A plus B. And for this past fiscal year, the Permit Services Center collected $14,878,053 compared to $11,071,215 the previous fiscal year. That $14.9 million represents all of the monies that were paid through the Permit Services Center, including all of the other departments that collect fees through the PSC. If you take a look at the very bottom line, which is called total, this is a revenue total that I keep track of to see what the health of the building department is. And basically what this represents is all of the fees that are collected by building and safety. What we do is we take that $14.9 million and we subtract all of the pass-through fees. And so what we ended up with is $5,430,035. All of that is building and safety specific revenue compared to the previous fiscal year of $4,491,508. This represents a 21% increase. In the little box in the lower right-hand corner, you will see a figure called cost recovery ratio. In order to be responsible in managing my budget within building and safety, I always compare the revenue that we bring in to the actual cost to provide the services, and I am very happy to report that we've been very responsible in this regard, including our city's full cost allocation and ISD surcharge. The cost recovery ratio for building and safety this past fiscal year was 1.287. So we brought in enough money to pay for all of our services. Not one penny to pay for a plan check, an inspection, or staff at the Permit Services Center had to be subsidized by the general fund. All services provided by building and safety were paid for by the applicants for which those services were provided. If you flip the page, we get to the building activity report, and this will give you an idea where all of that activity came from. We break down our projects into residential projects and non-residential projects, and then we also break it down into additions and alterations. Of interest, if you take a look at row number 3, multifamily dwellings, you will see that this year, multifamily dwellings, so apartments and condominiums, had a total valuation of about $47.5 million compared to last year of about $25.4 million. That means that the valuation of residential projects for which permits were issued this past year was 87% higher than the previous year. Clearly, this is an indicator that the economy is fairly healthy, and we are seeing construction here in Glendale, as can also be seen by the revenue that came in. What is perhaps even a better indicator of this, and I am very pleased to see this, is item number 7. Row number 7 is our statistics for re-roofs. One might ask, why is this so significant? Re-roofs are a category of work that often falls into the deferred maintenance category. Oftentimes when money is tight and people cannot afford to have certain work done, they forego work that they believe, I'll just wait till next year, or I'll wait till the year after that. I'll wait till I can afford it. And what we saw in past years with it, re-roof numbers were down. This particular year, re-roofs nearly doubled. And you can see that in 2 areas. Number one, the valuation of the re-roof work here in Glendale literally spiked from the previous fiscal year of $3.7 million to $6.2 million of re-roof work. That is a lot of re-roofing work here in our city, $6.2 million. So we kept the roofers busy. Also, if you slide to the left of that same row, these are our actual counts. This past year, 701 buildings had re-roof work done on it for which permits were issued. If you compare that to the previous year, this is what I meant by deferred maintenance. When the economy is bad and people choose where to spend their money, we only had 501 re-roofing jobs the previous year. So it would certainly appear as if the economy is seeing some good signs. If you move down to row number 21, you'll see something else interesting. Commercial buildings. Why is this interesting? This also is somewhat indicative of the health of our economy, at least our local economy here in Glendale, because the valuation of commercial buildings for this past fiscal year closed out at $90,980,304, almost $91 million in commercial construction activity, more than double the valuation that we saw for the same fiscal period the year before at roughly $40 million. What's really interesting is this. If you slide over that particular row, you will see that that represented 479 different projects this particular year. That number is almost the same as the previous year, 460 projects the previous fiscal year. So the volume of projects didn't go up, but the valuation more than doubled. That means that people had the confidence to build projects, same number of projects, more than double the valuation. That's a combination of a bunch of things. Glendale is a desirable place to build, and the commercial buildings, which is what I'm focusing here in row number 21, this is where our economic development, our desirability in terms of locating a business, or whether it be a restaurant or a movie theater or something else in Glendale, really shows. And what this shows is that we've been pretty stable, whereas some cities are fluctuating. We're still above the $200 million mark. Our totals for this past year was $216,970,214 worth of construction work here in Glendale. That is a lot of construction. The last thing that I want to point out is lower right-hand corner, our customer count. We continue to be extremely busy at the Permit Services Center. The last month that closed out the fiscal year, June, we had 2,484 walk-in customers. That's in 1 month. Over 2,000 people. For the entire year, we had 23,376 people walk through our doors compared to the previous year-to-date of almost the same amount, but slightly less, 22,979 people walked through our doors. So in addition to all of the phone assistance and email assistance and fax assistance and so forth that we provide this community, over 23,000 people walked through our doors at the PSC. So we have been extremely busy, and I'm happy to say that at least the economy in Glendale looks like it's fairly healthy. So with that concludes my report, some good news, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to address them.
Mr. Chair, I have a question. Where's the window category falling? Window. That's a sensitive matter these days. I'd like to have a comment on that before you adjourn, Mr.
There are alterations probably to the residential alterations.
Yes.
We don't track window permits
Because
individually.
you've done such a good job breaking everything down.
Thank
I was just
Thank you very
curious.
much. Yeah, we do go to great lengths to keep track of all of this. I've never been asked for individual statistics on windows, and you are right, it is a sensitive area. Fortunately, that sensitivity does not seem to be driven by building or fire codes, and so with that, I will leave it at that if you
Okay.
have any comments.
I had a similar question, and it was in regards to, I know there's a permit available in the city for kitchen and bath,
Yes.
and that must fall under one of the...
Falls under residential additions and alterations. What it is a homeowner has two options. If they would like, they can certainly secure an individual building permit to remodel their kitchen and bathroom, and along with that, secure a separate plumbing permit for the plumbing work, separate electrical permit for all the new lighting and so forth. Or if they would like, they can secure a combination permit. And the combination permit is a slightly less expensive way to do it, in which that one combination permit includes not only the building approval, but also the subtrade approval as well. Most of our homeowners do choose to go with the combination permit because it saves them a little bit of money.
The trip and the effort.
One more question.
What?
I'm noticing the fees that you had reviewed, the library mitigation fee, the parks mitigation fee, parks Quimby fee.
Yes.
Should there be a consistency? Is that a regular fee that's charged to a building permit, or if there's 27, if the count is 27 for library mitigation, shouldn't that be consistent for the other ones, or
No.
what is the deviation there?
There are different criteria which trigger different fees, and here in the city of Glendale, and actually all cities, we do not indiscriminately charge fees. We only charge fees to projects for which those fees are applicable. So the reason that the numbers for the different fee categories is different is in some cases a fee applies, and in other cases it doesn't. If it doesn't apply, we don't charge the fee.
Would you know if those fees are valuation-based? Is it residential, commercial, or is it a different department that handles that altogether?
To tell you the truth, some of the fees are based on different things. In some instances, it is based on valuation. In other instances, it might be based on the number of bedrooms or other characteristics of the project.
Okay. I also wanted to point out in this very comprehensive report that item number 14, back of the page, item number 14 says other structures, and I believe that applies to commercial other structures. There seems to be a substantial drop in the revenue for commercial activity. I mean, from close to 10 million compared to 90 million. Is that correct?
That is correct. We double-check every single number that goes into the report.
It's not a typo.
The reason for that is you will notice that we have certain very common categories like mixed-use buildings, service stations, office buildings, schools, retail, and then we lump everything else into other structures. Some of those other structures might be very significant. They might be huge parking structures for DreamWorks or for Disney, some of which may be above ground, some which may be subterranean, in which case there's a lot of expense that goes on there. But we do lump a lot of structures, and some of our big projects may fall into that other category as well. But no, that is not a mistake. That is an accurate number.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, before you close the meeting, I
Yes.
had something, whether it's under this board's preview or not. I understand there's a fee increase, Mr. Tom, coming up.
There will be some fees that will be increased citywide. We have now, as a city, undertaken a task to have a citywide fee study. I believe that as far as anybody might be concerned with building and safety, that our fees are going to be relatively stable. In order to move forward with the city's comprehensive fee adjustment, a consultant, Wildan and Associates, was actually hired to take a look at the actual cost of providing services by all of the different departments. And I'm very happy to say that because Building and Safety has always been very responsible in analyzing our costs, our departmental fees were the only ones which did not have a recommendation for being increased. Virtually all of the other departments did adjust their fees to bring them more in line with the actual cost, but Building and Safeties were actually right in line with where they should be. To that end, we do not anticipate any significant adjustments to the fees at all. The only adjustments that we typically plan on are typical adjustments to match CPI. As the cost of construction materials and everything else goes up, and the cost of our providing service goes up, if CPI goes up by 1% or 2%, our fees will be adjusted by the same amount. But unlike what most people perceive as a fee increase, where a fee might be increased by 25% or by, in some cases, doubled or tripled, that's not the case with our fees.
But if it does, would this would this board have a preview to review these changes? Because I looked at the ordinance, somehow I understood it that it does, but you please clarify.
This board can be used as a sounding board, and your input would certainly be taken and shared with the City Council upon presentation. Ultimately, the fees are set at the discretion of the City Council by resolution, but our City Council is very good in taking all input, and if we were planning on rather significant changes to our fees and brought them through this board, and this board had any comments that you would like forwarded to the City Council before consideration, I would be duty-bound to do that, certainly.
Thank you very much, because I would appreciate that, because I looked at the ordinance, and, I know I'm new at this board, but I like, to see what our duties are, and I'm not just here listening to appeals or...
Rest assured,
Yeah.
if Building and Safety has any significant changes or modifications to our fees, we would not do that in a vacuum. We would do it in a public, open forum, and this is our public, open forum. We would invite comments from the general public, from the people who would be paying those fees, in other words, the developers. We would take all of that into consideration using this board as a medium to do that, and then we would move it forward to the City Council. But at this time, we are not planning on any changes.
But can you revisit fees? The reason I'm saying I'm going
At
to
the
the
City
window
Council's
part,
discretion.
because the community is really concerned, and the reason I'm questioning, I see a lot of window being replaced over the weekend, and 75% they're not permitted. If we increased, because I heard that the window permit fees is increasing, if I'm not mistaken.
No, our window fees are not increasing.
Not increasing. Well, that's good, because that discourages even further for people to get permits, and we're going to have all kinds of problems.
Understood.
That's all, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the board members?
With that, we will note and file the report. I would like, if I may, Mr. Chairman,
please.
before you accept a motion for adjournment, I would like to make one public reminder. I would like to remind the general public that starting this Monday, on August 20th, the counter hours for our Permit Services Center will be adjusted. We have made adjustments in both directions over the years, and starting August 20th, our public counter hours, our general hours, are going to be adjusted to 7 a.m. until noon, Monday through Friday. After that, general walk-in customers will not be served. However, I do want to have everyone rest assured that we will continue to take individual appointments to see people even after those hours are closed, up through the close of our business day, which is 5 p.m. But in order to maximize our efficiency, our public hours, we're trying to wrap our arms around when we see the public instead of just having walk-in customers come in throughout the hours of the day. We're going to adjust those to the hours of 7 till noon. Right now, we are staying open from 7 until 3. So 3 hours at the tail end of each day are going to be adjusted, and we'll just have to see how that works. We have had announcements that have been handed out to the general public every day for the past month. Our regular customers have already commented, and they'll adjust to the new hours. I'm taking this opportunity, since we are being broadcast on cable TV, that the people who may not know it, who are our homeowners, if they are making any plans on coming in anytime after this Monday, to try and come in the early morning hours.
May I suggest something? Put it on Channel 6.
Oh, that's actually a great idea.
So people will know, because I was surprised too. I haven't been here for a few weeks, and I see the sign where we're starting new hours.
I would like to point out that there is always an adjustment period. We experienced it before, and we actually anticipate that for about a month there will be some inconvenience. And in advance, I would like to apologize if it does inconvenience somebody who doesn't know that we've adjusted our hours. But we have adjusted our hours in the past. At one time, we were closed every Tuesday and Thursday at 12:30, and we're basically just going back to, so you remember those days.
Friday.
And for a while, we were actually closed on Fridays. We changed that so we are open every Friday. What we're really trying to do is add some consistency. When we adjusted our hours from 4:30 until 3 p.m., it was out of operational necessity, and people actually got adjusted to that pretty quickly. And now people just do their business before 3 p.m. While it may seem severe to adjust our hours until noon, we think that people will adjust right away. And our belief is that it is better to have the same consistent hours every single day of the week than having to close one day or another, or have different hours, different days of the week. And we'll adjust as necessary if it is justifiable. But in the meantime, I do want everyone to rest assured that if they do need to make special arrangements to see somebody after those times, we will accommodate individual appointments to see your plan checker or to see me or anybody else, as long as those arrangements are made in advance.
But
so
not
thank you.
for permit issues.
No. And the reason for that is we need to have sufficient time to close out our cash registers and do our cash handling things. And so we're going to make that adjustment. Thank you.
So, I'm sorry, for the clarification purposes, then only walk-in customers are limited to morning 7 to 12, or also by appointment? Somebody has a verification appointment ceremony. They can't do it in the afternoon either?
An appointment is an appointment. If you are in need of an afternoon appointment and you schedule an appointment with your specific plan check engineer for 4 p.m., for example, we will continue to do that just as we are right now. Even though our hours today close our public counter at 3 p.m., if you have a 4 o'clock appointment, your engineer sees you. Same thing will apply. That is not going to change. We will continue to see appointments for people at any time that you and your staff member can mutually set up an appointment time. That won't change.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Sure. And with that, I think now would be a good time for a motion for adjournment.
We have a motion to adjourn the meeting.
I make a motion, we adjourn the meeting.
Thank you.
I will second that motion.
Thank you, and please join us next time. The meeting is now adjourned.